In fact, Australia has taken a very distinctively different approach to the issues raised for our long-term security by the US-China strategic competition from what our neighbours have done. Because what Australia has done, notwithstanding what people like Penny Wong have said, is to unambiguously side with the United States in its contest with China. To unambiguously declare that America's objectives are our objectives. Whereas for Australians, I think, we're having a moment of panic, really, I think that's the right word, that the idea of us living in an Asia which is no longer dominated and made safe for us by the United States is kind of unthinkable for a lot of Australians. And the irony, the peculiarity is that this is happening at a time when, for purely demographic reasons, we are becoming less and less European and more Asian.
May I ask you, do you think that this sense of insecurity is rooted to just this European past? Because if you say Australia feels alone, I mean, Indonesia is right there. Down there, it's like, okay, it's smaller, and you know, you're surrounded by a lot of people, and China has I think you have a good trade relationship with them, right? So what I sense to hear from you is that a lot of this has to do that Australia actually perceives itself as inherently European, inherently part of that colonial enterprise that we believe is over, but actually still dominates our way of thinking. Is that a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really important points. Because, of course, what you say is absolutely right. The fact is, we might feel alone, but we're not alone. In fact, you know, if you think of, you know, Australia's basic interests align very closely with those of the countries in our closer neighbourhood, particularly in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, but also Singapore, Malaysia, you know, the whole lot. You know, we all want the same thing. Everybody is worried about how China, and for that matter, India, are going to use their rising power. Everybody wants to maintain good relations with those two countries. Everyone would, in fact, prefer America to continue to play some kind of role in Asia to help balance China's and I think eventually India's power and, you know, prevent them from getting too hegemonic. None of us want to find ourselves living in a new Cold War in Asia. None of us want to suffer the consequences of having to make a choice between America and China. And so, you know, at one level you'd think, you know, the natural way for Australia to respond to this predicament that we've been discussing is to draw closer to our neighbours. And when you listen to what Australian political leaders, at least some Australian political leaders, say in their speeches, it sounds like that's what we're doing. Our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, for example, makes a great play of saying that, you know, Australia is drawing closer and closer to our Southeast Asian neighbours as we deal with the increased fluidity and uncertainty of our strategic neighbourhood, you know, all that kind of language. But the fact is, it's not true. And the reason it's not true is that, in fact, Australia has taken a very distinctively different approach to the issues raised for our long-term security by the US-China strategic competition from what our neighbours have done. Because what Australia has done, notwithstanding what people like Penny Wong have said, is to unambiguously side with the United States in its contest with China. To unambiguously declare that America's objectives are our objectives, and that what we seek is for the US to defeat China's challenge and preserve its position as a leading power in East Asia, just like it's always been in the past. And that's not a view shared by any of our neighbours, except perhaps Japan. Now, Japan's a very interesting special case, it seems to me. And I'm sure you know a lot more about Japan than I do, but if you look at all the others, if you look at all of the Southeast Asians, and I might say also from my perspective, I don't regard myself as an expert on this, but from my perspective, South Korea as well, all of them, as I touched on a second ago, would like the United States to stay engaged in Asia to balance China. But they don't believe it's possible for the United States to preserve the old role it used to play in Asia. And they're not prepared to commit themselves to support the United States in pursuing the United States objectives in the strategic contest with China, whereas that's precisely what Australia has done. And one of the most significant things about the AUKUS agreement is that it's become a very potent symbol of that commitment. And that's the way it's seen, certainly the way it's seen in Washington. I think it's also the way it's seen in Canberra. If there was any doubt before AUKUS that Australia has committed itself absolutely to supporting the United States in the United States approach to the challenge from China, then AUKUS removed it. And my reservation about that is that I don't think the US approach to China is going to work. I think I do not believe the United States can preserve the old US-led order in Asia based on US primacy in the face of a challenge from China when China is the most formidable strategic rival the United States has ever faced. And I therefore think US policy is going to fail, and I therefore think Australian policy is going to fail. And the fact that we've aligned ourselves with what I think is a failing US policy has actually increased the distance between us and our Southeast Asian neighbours at exactly the time when we should be reducing it.
And isn't there another danger as well? I mean, as a strategist and probably also to a good part a realist in IR, aren't you worried that Australia might simply become a pawn in this strategic competition, or like even if it comes to that, to a war? Because one of the things is really interesting when I talk to Southeast Asian colleagues, most of them, especially the ones from Malaysia, they say very strongly, don't lecture us on how to deal with China. We've dealt with them for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
We're fine with it. Now, Australia is much younger in that sense, right? Is that like this insecurity of being a 200-year-old nation that just learns how to play the game?
Yeah, well, yes, these are the big questions. Because, of course, one part of all of that is that our neighbours, although they do, as I mentioned before, of course, they prudently reflect on, worry about how China will use its growing power. They'd be unwise not to. But they don't regard it as unthinkable that they should learn to live with a powerful China, learn to manage it. It's going to take a bit of flexibility. They'll have to do a bit of ducking and weaving, but that's what middle powers do in the face of great powers. I mean, this is no news to Europeans. The whole history of the smaller and middle European powers is that they've lived with this patchwork of great powers, and they've learnt that there are certain things you have to do in order to manage those relationships. They've taken different approaches. Switzerland's taken one approach, Belgium took another approach, the Netherlands took another approach, but you can do this. I think, what strikes me when I talk to my Southeast Asian friends and colleagues is that although they're prudently aware of the risks that accrue to them, they're also just sort of pretty confident that they can make this work. And I think that's partly, to go precisely to the point you raised, it's because, of course, they have a deep historical memory of what it's like to live in a Chinese hemisphere. And that's a very crude way of putting it, but you know what I mean. Whereas for Australians, I think we're having a moment of panic, really. I think that's the right word, that the idea of us living in an Asia which is no longer dominated and made safe for us by the United States is kind of unthinkable for a lot of Australians. And the irony, the peculiarity is that this is happening at a time when, for purely demographic reasons, we are becoming less and less European and more Asian. Australia for many decades, and to its eternal shame, adopted a white Australia policy whereby it essentially, rejected immigrants from non-white countries. In the late 60s and early 70s, that policy was abandoned, thank heaven. Since then, we've had massive immigration from a wide range of Asian countries. Our biggest sources of immigrants these days are India and China. And so, there are well over a million, probably I think 1.2 million Australians out of 25 million of Chinese descent, comparable numbers from India. So in fact, and that trend will continue. We are becoming a more Asian a more Asian country. And so we should, in a sense, be becoming more comfortable with these things. In fact, as the shock of China's rise and challenge has hit home to us over the last decade or so, we've become more uncomfortable with the idea of living in an Asia dominated by powerful Asian countries than we were 30 or 40 years ago. If you go back to the 1960s or 1970s, although it wasn't actually happening, it was quite common for Australian political leaders to recognise that in the decades to come, as Asian countries developed, they would become more powerful and we'd end up living in an Asia that was dominated by Asian powers. But now that it's actually happening, we're kind of recoiling from that and panicking about it. I think one reason for that is that the present generation, I speak of someone who's a little bit older than the majority of the present generation, came of age not in the era of Vietnam, but in the post-Cold War decade of the 1990s, when there was, for a time, a kind of very naive optimism about the way in which we were going to live in a world dominated by America for as far ahead as we could see. And so I think, in a sense, the generations that lived through the First and the Second World Wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the challenges that America faced, had a more realistic perspective of the scope and limits of American power than the generation that came of age in the heady, optimistic, I think, misguided years of the 1990s.
So do you think this skews the current perception of Australia when it comes to the security issue? Because like one more thing that strikes me is that when I hear these fears, especially of China, is that it always assumes, very much like Mr. Mersheimer does, that China, at the end of the day, will behave just like any European power would.
Yeah.
And once it has power, it will use it, and it will use it militarily, and it will go out on a conquest spree, and it will take whatever it wants, which is a very European thing to do, because this is basically what we did. This is why Australia was settled with the whites, right?
Yeah, that's why we're here. No, that's exactly right. Look, I think there's 2 points to make there, or 2 steps to the process. When I and others started thinking about this issue in the 1990s, when it became clear that China's transformation under Xi Jinping, beginning in the late 70s, when by the late 80s, early 90s, it became clear that that was working and that something big was happening in China. And it did take really until the end of the 80s for that to become really clear. Then and I was working in government, then we started thinking about what that was going to mean in the longer term. And we quite quickly, so to speak, began a debate within Australian strategic circles about what it meant. And there were 2 views. And the first was that as China's power grew, it would seek to challenge the US as the leading power in East Asia and assert its own position as the region's leading power, and try and push the United States out. In other words, the deal that was done between Nixon and Mao in 1972, whereby Nixon recognized the Chinese Communist Party as the government of China, roughly speaking, and the Chinese recognized America, or accepted America as the leading power in East Asia. That deal would be reneged on once China was strong enough to do so. And I argued that was what would happen. And a lot of people argued, no, that wouldn't happen because China is different. That's a European model of what great powers do. And in fact, what we should expect is that China will accept and continue to accept America's leadership in East Asia because it's in China's interest, particularly its economic interest. And I think that turned out to be wrong. I think China is actually behaving very much as Mearsheimer or others would predict, in seeking to challenge US leadership in Asia, in seeking to assert a great power sphere of influence in its own region, the way great powers traditionally do, and I might say the way Japan did in its day, in its imperial time. But that's not to say that a China that ends up as the dominant power, or seeking to become the dominant power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, thereby seeks to do so in what you might call a highly militarized way. It doesn't mean that it's going to behave the way the British did, or the French did, or the Germans did, or the Russians did. In fact, I think there's, as we were touching on before, I think there are a lot of different models of regional hegemony. And my own view has always been that China is unlikely to be a highly militarized hegemonist, partly because of the strategic geography of the region. So much of it's maritime, and that's a very different challenge from the sort of continental challenges that the Europeans faced. Partly because of the distribution of power. This is not like the Europeans erupting into an Africa, or for that matter, in East Asia, which by the time they got there was composed of pretty weak political entities. So, China is by far and away the strongest power in East Asia, but there are countries like, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia. These are pretty robust entities. They're not going to be knocked over. So I've always thought that China was likely to take the first step, that is to seek to overturn US hegemony in the region and take its place. But I never thought it was particularly likely that it was going to do it in a particularly militaristic way. It was going to adopt different kind of approaches. Now, I do think China has a very serious military agenda in relation to Taiwan, but I think Taiwan is a special case, a very special case. But I think otherwise, and this goes back to the point I made before, I don't believe that China threatens Australia militarily, nor do I think it threatens Japan or South Korea or Thailand militarily. It could conceivably, if as its power grows, and if it succeeds in establishing a regional hegemony, if it chooses to express that, implement that hegemony in a particularly aggressive way, then that becomes a problem. But I don't think that's the most likely outcome. And one of the reasons why, unlike many people in the Australian debate, I think Australia can and should accept the prospect of a Chinese-led Asia is A, I don't think we can avoid it. But B, I think if we play our cards right, we can manage it pretty well. It doesn't seem to me to be all that hard. So I don't think we in Australia need to be nearly as worried about it as we are. We should take more of the more relaxed approach that our Southeast Asian neighbours take.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好，用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。